Good evening and welcome to the final session of our series, Overflow. During this series, God has rained down so many blessings on us through His Word. We've used the example that our hearts are really like these vessels designed to receive that rain of God's love and the rain of grace and forgiveness and mercy, God's salvation. And we've used the imagery of these buckets being like our hearts. Now, our theme verse for this series comes from Isaiah 12, verse 3, and it says, "With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation." So in week one, we talked about the fact that if our hearts are full of junk, if our hearts are full of rocks, dirt, trash, then there's not really any room or as much room to add anything good and clean in that bucket. And what little water that you could put in this bucket would just get muddy and dirty, and it wouldn't be good anymore. And so that week we talked about the story of John the Baptist. John's purpose was to prepare the way for Jesus. John did not get distracted by his own sin, and in the process, he did not fall into the trap of thinking too much or too little of himself. Instead, he remained focused on God and his calling for his life to prepare the way for Jesus. John's focus allowed him to pursue God's purpose in baptizing others and offering them forgiveness. John's example of baptism reminds us that just as a dirty bucket is useless for drawing water from a well, we can only effectively receive God's blessing and be a blessing to others if our hearts are washed clean from sin. Sin is the result of putting ourselves first, either in the form of pride or of shame. Sin causes us to think more about ourselves than we think about God's will or others. It's a distraction that's harmful to the kingdom work of God. In week two, we learned about the fact that not only, does our bucket need to be clean, but it also needs to be whole. If our bucket is full of cracks and holes, then anything that gets poured in is just going to run right out. And that week we discussed the story of the woman at the well. This woman was completely different than the crowds who went out into the wilderness to meet John the Baptist that we talked about the week before. They went out to receive forgiveness from sin. That's what they were seeking. Actually, the story about the woman at the well wasn't about sin at all. It's a story of healing. Jesus offered this woman healing by listening to her, by seeing her as a worthwhile human being, and treating her with love. This woman's heart was full of holes that were caused by painful relationships that she'd endured in life. She'd lost several husbands, either through death or divorce, and she was shunned by society because of her current living situation as well as her ethnic background. In the same way, a bucket with holes can't be used to draw water from a well. Jesus took time to repair this woman's heart before she was convinced to become an evangelist for Jesus' message. By healing her heart, then she was able to accept and receive the love and the forgiveness and the grace and the mercy that Jesus offered. And then she was excited and able to go share it with others. And then last week, that's exactly what we talked about. Sharing the love of Jesus with other people in an overflow of the heart. The reason that we are called to keep our hearts clean and whole is so that we can be a blessing to other people. Jesus showed us an example of loving service when he washed his disciples' feet. We are to use our hearts as instruments of God's salvation and redemption. Jesus said, "A servant is not greater than their master." We are servants of Jesus who calls us to serve others through an overflow of love. Our hearts are only strong enough to overflow in love when we continually accept the forgiveness and healing of Jesus. Whenever we backslide and experience pain and brokenness, Jesus is there to renew our hearts so that we are once again able to overflow in love and service. And so Jesus is constantly healing and forgiving and filling us with love, just to see that love flow out of us. And it's tempting to think that this system of overflow is God's grand and final plan for all of humanity. God will love us and will pour that love out into others for all of eternity and as long as we're alive. God will keep patching our hearts from pain and washing our hearts when they're dirty from sin. The system of overflow is how things work now, but it's not how things will work in heaven. Tonight we're going to be looking at a passage from the book of Revelation. And if you don't know anything about that book, it's found at the very end of the Bible, and it's actually a book of prophecy that talks about things that have not yet happened. Now, traditionally, it's believed that the author of this is the same man who wrote the Gospel of John, which we've pulled a lot of our verses from for the past few weeks. And it's that same John that wrote the book of Revelation. John was a disciple of God, and God gave him a vision of the future and a glimpse of what things will be like after he has finished remaking the world. So Revelation is very cryptic. It can be confusing to read. But the story of Revelation is amazing and spectacular. But they're difficult for John to communicate. So John uses a lot of symbolism and comparison in order to help us understand even just a glimpse of what he has experienced and what things will be like, because really everything that he saw in heaven and how things will be, there's nothing that even comes close to comparison here on earth in the now. So let's break things down simply tonight. Regardless of all of that, there's a passage from the end of the book that I want us to look at tonight. It's one of my favorite verses, and it comes from Revelation 21, and we're going to start in verse 1. It says this: "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.' He who was seated on the throne said, 'I am making everything new.' Then he said, 'Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true.' He said to me, 'It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life. Those who are victorious will inherit all this, and I will be their God, and they will be my children.'" This passage, this text, is a description of the new world that God will create when this world passes away. Do you notice that the passage says new heaven and new earth? It's a new place that functions completely different from the way things work on earth today. So often Christians will focus on the short-term vision of God. We either are concerned about being forgiven of our sin in order to get into heaven, or we're concerned about making this world a better place while we're here by showing others love. Both of these things are important to the message of Jesus, but they are not the end of the story. God has a bigger plan than just forgiveness and service to others. Throughout this series, we have talked about how God pours love and blessing and forgiveness and grace and mercy and salvation into our hearts, and how our hearts, if they're in good condition, if they're clean, if they're free of holes, they'll fill up and overflow God's love and blessing into the lives of others. This is how things work right now, but according to the book of Revelation, this is not how we will live with God in the world to come. God makes all things new in the world to come. God's love will not overflow. God's love is going to overwhelm. How does it change your perspective to know that God's final plan is to bring us all into an environment of an overwhelming, flooding love? The system of overflow, the way God pours into our lives and we pour into the lives of others, is beautiful, but it's not the ultimate word. It's not the ultimate hope in our lives. It's not the last word. God has something even more spectacular and more glorious planned, and if we were to end our series just talking about overflowing in service to others, I don't think that we would do the message of Jesus justice, because that's not where God's ministry ends. I want you to think about it this way. Some of you might be driving already, and some of you might be thinking about driving, and you may be talking with your parents right now about what kind of car you will drive if they decide to get you a car. Now, my first car was a 1983 Postal Jeep. It had sliding doors. The driver's seat was on the right-hand side. My uncle had purchased it from a county salvage auction, and he did a little bit of tinkering on it to keep it on the road. He spray painted it green, and he spray painted the top of it tan and made it look kind of like it was a convertible, but it wasn't. There was even one day he was driving to work, and he was on a big curve of an overpass on the interstate and had a blowout, which caused it to flip over on its side and slide down the road. He managed to get it back upright and was able to drive it home, but the door handle was bent in, and so you couldn't lock the door, but that was okay because you really couldn't open the door unless you knew the trick on how to get it open. A lot of times you had to open it from the outside because the inside wouldn't work anymore. He gifted it to me when I was 15, and my dad and I spent the next year banging out the dents, trying to get things to work. We rebuilt the engine, we worked on the wiring, we put in new seats and seat belts and all of this stuff, and I drove it and I loved it. It was my first car and it was mine and it was great. But it seemed like every time I would fix one thing, something else would break, and I would spend a lot of time fixing and repairing and cleaning and washing constantly. Eventually, the transmission gave out, and it wasn't worth repairing anymore, and I had to get a new car. Now, right now, most of us are driving around with hearts that have a lot of mileage on them. Throughout life, your heart will be broken into. It'll be in accidents. It'll need repairs. It'll be driven too hard and need rest. It's going to become filthy and need to be scrubbed clean too many times to count. But in the book of Revelation, God does not say that he's fixing and cleaning things. God says he is making all things new. First, Revelation says a new heaven and a new earth are coming, and when they come, no longer will God feel distant. No longer will the risen Jesus live in heaven, but the text says God's dwelling place, where he will live, where he will be, will be among the people. There will be no division between us and God. God dwelling among us means all the systems of oppression and injustice will come to an end. We will not be ruled over by broken governments or live in hurtful communities. There will be no racism, sexism, or prejudice. There will be no world pandemics. No one will be treated badly or excluded. Instead, God will be with us in person and rule in and over us in perfection. We will no longer be subjected to the rough and tumble world we experience today. It will be smooth sailing or smooth driving, as it were. Then, after the old world passes away, Revelation says Jesus himself will wipe every tear, and all of us with broken hearts will be healed for good. The passage says that there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Not only does God heal us, God will continually get rid of anything that could ever hurt us again, and everything that keeps us separated from Him will be gone. We will live with God, overwhelmed by His goodness and love, never again needing to have our hearts cleaned of sin or needing our hearts repaired from hurt or brokenness. As we close out this series, it's important to look at how God's vision for all of humanity is going to end. I want us to look at this scripture once again. From Revelation 21, 6 through 7, He said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life. Those who are victorious will inherit all of this, and I will be their God, and they will be my children." These are trustworthy. These words are trustworthy. John has seen a vision of this happening, and he wrote it down so that we can anticipate what is going to happen in the future. This is what I want us to focus on as we close. God is bringing us, sorry, I thought I got rid of that. There we go. God is bringing us out of this system of overflow and into this system of being overwhelmed. No longer are we going to need buckets to receive the blessing of God, God pouring blessing and forgiveness and salvation into us and us overflowing into others, because God is going to give us without cost, without hesitation, without reservation. He's going to give us water, all the water we can have from the water of the well of life. This fresh, beautiful, life-giving water is from our own Father's hand. We will be waist deep in God's blessing, neck deep in the flood of God's love. We will no longer need to live a life of overflow, passing water on to others for all of eternity in this eternal life. Instead, we will live a life overwhelmed by God, flooded by His love and goodness. Water will be everywhere. God's salvation will be everywhere, free and abundant. So how would your life change? How would your mindset change if you rested in, if you trusted in the hope of God's overwhelming love for all of eternity? Today we're invited to live a life of overflow, but we're also called to anticipate the life and live in hope as we await the new kingdom where we'll live each moment overwhelmed by God's love. Not just filled to overflowing, but overwhelmed, flooded by God's love. God is not done with us yet. I want to thank you for joining us in this series, and I pray that it was a blessing to you. And as always, if you have any questions or needs, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I would love to talk with you more, to answer any questions that you may have. Maybe you haven't accepted Jesus into your life yet and experienced that salvation and that forgiveness. And if that's the fact, I would love to talk with you. Please reach out to me so we can talk more. This is going to be our last video lesson for now. Next week, we're actually going to be starting to meet in some small groups on Wednesday nights. And I hope to see everyone then. So until next time, as always, be safe, stay clean, and please wash your hands. I love you guys, and I can't wait to see you next week in our small groups.